Welcome to Casual Friday. This week I knit a very quick little project. I made some progress on my vintage sweater, including finding some great buttons, and I went to the Minnesota State Fair. Just like with Technique Tuesday videos, if you want to jump to a specific point in the video, you can find links to each section down in the description. So the Knitters Guild has a committee that's in charge of the charity projects for the year. The Guild always chooses 2 charities at the start of every year, and that's what the focus is if you want to do charity knitting. And often we have donated yarn that we can use if we want to knit something for the charity project. But on Tuesday, they made an announcement that they had gotten a request from an organization on the West Coast for some knitted birds' nests for orphaned baby birds. Now, I had seen these kinds of patterns before, like on Facebook, and usually once things hit Facebook or social media, these kinds of organizations that need, 20 of something end up with 6,000 of them, and it's like they're overwhelmed and they don't have storage space. So usually when I see these little adorable charity projects for little baby animals, I immediately want to do it, and then I discover, oh no, they've got way more than they need already. So I never pursued the bird's nest. But I picked up one of the patterns and I brought it home. So I did a little investigation. A couple of years ago, they ended up with 6,000 nests. So they did not need any nests after 2017. But I think even at that time, they were kind of short on the large bird's nest. So when some orphaned baby birds are teeny tiny because the adults aren't very big, like hummingbirds. Like a baby hummingbird is teeny tiny, but a baby blue jay is pretty big. So they need larger nests for larger birds and tiny nests for tiny birds. And so they were specifically asking our guild to knit 35 large birds' nests. And so now I understand a little better about why their website doesn't say that they want birds' nests, why they're not making sort of a wide appeal for all different sizes from all sorts of places. But I thought it was pretty cute. Basically, it's a hat that's knit at a very dense gauge because the hat needs to be able to stand up on its own. And then the crown of the hat, rather than alternating a round of decreases with a plain round, you just are doing decrease rounds until you're down to the last few. And that makes it a much flatter, in this case, bottom. But that's something to know for if you want to make a hat that's something like this that has a flat top, that if you eliminate the plain rounds when you're doing the decreases, that you could do something like that. You could create a little hat like this, a little derby if you wanted to. So that was what I did this week. So my 1930s cardigan, I have been working on the second sleeve. I'm probably halfway. It was the project I took with me to the fair when I was at the Knitters Guild booth yesterday, because we always need something to work on and show people that come to the demonstration booth. So I kind of waited until Wednesday to even get started on it. I didn't want to have the sleeve finished because it won't take me very long. So I did make some progress on the sleeve. It's not done. Still haven't sewn the first sleeve in, so it could be a big mistake to be knitting the second sleeve because I said that I was going to sew the first sleeve in and make sure that it was going to fit right. So we'll see what happens. I did go buy buttons for the cardigan, and I went to a store in St. Paul that I always go to get my cardigan buttons, and it's called Treadle Yard Goods. One of the things that I love about them, well, they have a lot of buttons, but they have vintage buttons. And in particular with these vintage sweaters, I'm really enjoying the idea of finding buttons that were from that era. And I thought this sweater was going to be a challenge to find buttons for a couple of reasons. One was just getting a color that would work right, color and shape that would work right, but also just the quantity. I need 10 buttons for this, and they pretty big size. So I went there and I asked to see their vintage buttons, and they brought them out, and there was nothing that had more than 9 in a set. And even when they had 9, they were not the right size, and they were like really elaborate. There's just not what I wanted for the sweater. So I left the sweater on the counter, and I went over to the wall where they have all of those tubes of buttons, just regular buttons. And I was looking, trying like, what color? Should I go light? Should I go dark? and I saw that there was something that looked kind of bluish purple. And I'm not in the right light. I'm not next to the sweater. I have terrible color memory and I'm slightly colorblind. So I was like, well, that looks like it's sort of the same color or near the same color. I wonder how those would work. And I pulled them out and I brought them over and I unscrewed the tube, dumped them out, and I started laying them on the sweater. And first of all, the buttons aren't, the buttonholes are bigger than the button, which in a sweater you don't want. But if a buttonhole is too big in a sweater, you can always make it smaller. So, but I started laying these buttons on. I thought, it's like the same exact color. I kind of like it. But I wasn't sure that they were the same color because, like I said, slightly colorblind. But the woman behind the counter, she was like pulled like by magnetic force. She goes, "Oh, those buttons are perfect." And I said, "Are they? They look good." And she's like, "Yeah." And then she said, "Well, those two are a little darker than the other ones. You might want to see if there's," which I couldn't tell that. There were enough buttons. There were 12 buttons in the tube plus one on top attached to the lid. So we were able to take out the two that were darker and the other two seemed fine. And then I was looking at like, what are these buttons? And it turns out they're painted shell. So they're shell buttons and they're painted, which might account a little bit for why there might be some variation in color. Like if the shell underneath is darker, that might cause the button itself to be darker. But I really like the buttons, so I am going to have to make the buttonholes a little bit smaller. And I'm thinking I might be doing the grosgrain ribbon stabilizer on the back again, like I did for the past couple of sweaters that I've knit, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to make that decision once the whole thing is put together, and then I'll decide. I'll have to wash and block it, make sure everything is the size I want, and then I'll make a decision about whether or not to put the ribbons on before I sew in the buttons. So yesterday was the first day of the Minnesota State Fair, and it is the day that the Minnesota Knitters Guild demonstrates in the demonstration booth within the Creative Activities building. So this year I volunteered for, I think it was the third shift. There's like 2 hours and 15 minutes is our shift. It was a 15-minute overlap. So my shift wasn't going to start until 12:45. I think last year I had the shift right before that. So I went to the fair at the very beginning. I went to a park and ride parking lot around 8 o'clock in the morning, waited for a bus, got to the fair, got to look around at all the knitting, and take my time until it was my time to be at the booth. So this year, I wasn't supposed to be there until 12:45. And at first I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to get there at 8 o'clock. And I thought, well, I don't need to be at the fair for 4 hours before my shift starts. We're fostering a little dog right now named Elton. He's sleeping here at my feet right now. I thought, well, I can take Elton to the dog park. He can play, he can get relaxed. He's going to be home alone most of the day, so then I'll take him home. I don't have to leave home till 10, and then I can go to the park and ride and get the bus, and I'll still be there in time to get something to eat and before my shift starts. In the past couple of years, the buses that you could take, whether you paid for them or they were free, have been a little harder to, a little bit more limited because of the lack of metro bus drivers. So I used to take a bus that's not very far from where I live, right here in the city, and I would pay like $5 and it would be a round trip. So it would take you right to the fairgrounds, and then whenever you're done, you just go to this particular place in the fairgrounds, and then the bus will take you back to where you parked your car. But last year they weren't running until noon from within the city. And only the suburbs had bus service starting at 8. So last year I had to find out about these park and ride free parking places that are closer to the fairgrounds, and then they have free shuttle buses. So I figured out, how to get to the university parking lots, and I did all of that, and then you just have to wait in this really long line and wait until, however many buses come, fill everybody up. But it's fine. It's free and it's reasonably convenient and no problem. So this year I left the house at 10 o'clock. I drove to the park and ride lots, lot full, and the lot across the lot full. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I rolled down my window to ask the attendant. She's like, oh, lot's full. I'm like, well, is there any lot that is open still? And she's like, no, they're all full. And And so then I thought, okay, well, they have parking at the fairgrounds, like $15 to pay. So I pulled over and I was Googling, how to, get to the fairground parking lots from where I was. And I saw, oh, the Minnesota State Fair has a Twitter account where they keep you updated on all the parking situation. And I looked at it and it said, all a park and ride lots are full, which I knew. All state fairground lots are full. And so then I'm like, now what am I going to do? And I thought, oh, this is the problem. If you don't get there first thing in the morning, nobody's leaving the fair for some number of hours. Later in the day, as people leave more, and there'll be, spots opening up, but there was no way. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. So I drove halfway home, got off the highway, pulled over, called a friend of mine. I said, can you do me this huge favor? Can you drive me to the park and ride? So she met me at my house, drove me to the park and ride, the place where all the lots were full, but there was no line for the buses because nobody was parking. Got on a bus and I got there about an hour before my shift started. So it all worked out, but I had never even thought about not being able to get parking. Even like going to the fairgrounds itself, I'd never had the experience of not being able to at least pay for parking. It just never occurred to me. And the weather was beautiful. So I think that was part of it. Sunny skies. It was in the high 60s, low 70s all day. It was low humidity. It was just beautiful. So the first thing I always do when I go to the fair, because I always go in the morning, sometimes we go in the evening. We'll go have dinner and we'll go to one of the craft beer places or something. But we usually, if we're going during the day, it's in the first thing in the morning. So my breakfast at the state fair is called caramel apple in a dish. If you're not from the Midwest, you'd call it caramel apple in a dish. So it's apple season is just starting. So they cut up an apple, it's cored, and then they cut it up and they put it in a little cardboard dish. They pour caramel over it, and then if you want, you can get a scoop of ice cream on it too. But that's my breakfast. So I ate my caramel apple in a dish. I went to the Creative Activities building. I went and I looked as much knitting as I could before my shift started, and I filmed some of it, and then after my shift I filmed a little bit more. So I did a quick run around of all of the knitting, and then I did my shift, which was really fun. I mentioned last week that if any of you are in Minnesota and going to be at the fair the first day, when I would be at the booth. So I brought my vintage sweaters. I had them in the display cabinet there, and I was talking to people. Sometimes people came up and they just wanted to know, if we have, my mother-in-law died and she left these 2 enormous boxes full of yarn. Where can we donate it? Or somebody would come up, I have all of these old knitting patterns, like they're 20 years old. Where can I donate them? So I would tell them about the Textile Center garage in April. Like, they need to hang on to it till April, but then they can donate it there. Or maybe a senior center might want it, or something like that. And then people came up and actually had specific knitting questions, like, if I want to work in the round, how can I join it so that it doesn't pull apart and have this big gap? And so I talked to this one woman about some of her challenges with working in the round, and I gave her my YouTube channel and some specific videos to look at. And there are people who are interested in the guild but don't live in the Twin Cities, and we were telling them about there are things that you can do that aren't on like a Tuesday night. And so just talking to people about all kinds of things. So I was talking to a couple of women about my 2 vintage sweaters, and I could see there was a third woman there. And at first I thought she was with them, and I kind of looked at her, and somehow I just knew she was not with them. But she was waiting to talk to me. So those 2 women went away, and then this other woman came up, and she said, her name's Karen. Hi, Karen. And she said that the first video of mine she watched was last year's state fair video. And I think she'd never entered anything, and she did enter something for the first time this year, and she said she didn't get a ribbon, which happens to a lot of us. I didn't win anything my first year I entered either, And then she showed me pictures of it, and it was from a vintage pattern. It was a Mary Maxim pattern probably from the 1950s that she got from their website. She told me where her sweater was hanging because I'd been through there, and I had with my camera, because I like to go through all of the cases and kind of film up and then film down all the way, so get a sense of everything. So she told me where to go look for it. So this is her sweater. It is really hard because there's so many things. Even if things win a ribbon, sometimes they're covered up. But they had a lot of sweaters hanging from the top that were kind of overlapped. And so I saw hers. And so I think her category was adult pullover, all over texture is what I'm assuming her category was. If it wasn't all over texture, it would be partial texture, because they have 66 different hand knitting categories, competition categories. And then there's another, I think, 22 categories that are outside of hand knitting that include hand knitting, like table linens. Table linens could be crocheted or knitted, or some other types of needlework could be included in table linens. In baby clothing, they don't have baby clothing within the hand knitting category. It's in baby clothing, and so you might, if you do a hat, it would be competing against crochet. So there's just different ways that hand knitting might be in other sorts of categories besides just the knitting category. And then separately is machine knitting. So I got video of all of that, so hopefully you'll be able to kind of see. And for the sweater categories, in the first place categories, I kind of I put little labels so you could see what category they would have been in. So I had a ton of fun. And while I was at my booth, my friend Celeste, who I met last year at this Weavers conference when I was learning to spin, and she has a monthly knitting group at her house that I've been to. So she's really an interesting woman. I've really enjoyed getting to know her. She was in the Weavers Guild part. It's like this big square, and we're in one side of the square, the Knitters Guild, and then the Weavers Guild is in half of it, going around the corner. So she was in the opposite side from me on a loom, but she came over and said hello. And then she said, on Monday, when I'm going to be at the Weavers Guild booth, she had signed up for the shift to be on the loom while I'll be spinning. And I was talking to her about my troubles getting to the fair on the bus. And it was, having to think, because I have to be there at 9 a.m. and I'm concerned about the lines, for the bus, even if I can get a parking spot. And she said her husband is going to drive her on Monday, and I can just drive to her house, and then I can bring my spinning wheel too. That was another thing I was worried about, was bringing that on the bus because it's so bulky. And then he'll drop us at the entrance, and then we can go in, and then they'll pick us up later, and we can just leave. So that's yay. So I'm very happy about that. So I'll talk more next week about my experience at the Weavers Guild booth, because that was really interesting last year, and I was a brand new spinner then. I'm not much more advanced now than I was then, but I know a little bit more about what to do at the booth, and then I'll have a friend there as well who can maybe help me out a little bit if I need it. So on my way back to the bus so that I could get home, I decided I wanted to get a brat, or bratwurst. I don't eat those very often, but summertime is for me, is like the quintessential time to have a bratwurst. And so I had downloaded, the Minnesota State Fair has a phone app where you can use it to find music. Like if you're looking for a particular band, what stage are they playing at, with different places, you can find different events like parades or this thing or that thing. But they have food, and food is a huge thing. And so you can type in your search like what kind of food you're looking for, and then it will tell you all of the places within 100 to 200 feet of you, where you are, that sell that food, and then who, 500 feet from you, and so on and so on. And so the ones that were really close to me were vendors that sold tons of other things. And I saw that there was one that was 500 feet from me that was called bratwurst. And I thought, well, that sounds very promising. and it was like halfway between me and the bus stop. So I found my way to there, and this app can kind of shows you the map, it shows you where you are, and it shows you where the thing is, so you can kind of figure out how to find your way there. So I walked up, and it was a small trailer. Like some of these booths are like larger trailers, like the caramel apple one I had been at in the morning. Probably had 5 or 6 teenage kids in it that were all working. This was much smaller, and it had enough room for 2 people. And it looked like it was probably the guy who owned the business, probably in his 60s, and probably his adult son is what it looked like. When I walked up to this little trailer, there was a sign on the side of it that said best bratwurst at the fair, and then it said $8. I thought, oh, fair food is so expensive. So I walk up there, and I was really thirsty too, and I said, do you sell bottled water? And he said, no, just brats. And I'm like, okay. And then I was looking to see if there's a menu. Do they have beer brats, cheese brats, curry brat? You know, do they have more than one kind of brat? There's no menu. So I said, okay, I'll take a brat. And he said, you want sauerkraut or no sauerkraut? And I said, well, I'll have a little bit of sauerkraut. And so he hands me this brat. You know, it's a regular sized bun, and the brat is sticking. The brat was like this long. And I'm like, well, that's why it was $8. And they had some sauerkraut on it. And then I looked to see, you know, could I put ketchup or anything on it? There's a big tub of mustard with a pump. That was it. So only brats, sauerkraut or no sauerkraut, mustard or no mustard. He did have napkins though. But I just thought it was kind of funny because some of these vendors sell all kinds of things, and some of them literally they sell the one thing and that's it. So I walk away, I took a bite from it, and I'm like, oh my god, it's so good. I think he's probably right. It probably is the best brat at the fair. I wouldn't doubt it. It was really good. So now I'm just going to show you my footage that I took of the fair. There's music playing in the background. You just hit the mute if you don't want to hear music. You're not going to hear any talking from here on. So enjoy. What are you going to get for lunch?